and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be talking about some of my favorite standalone fantasy books. One of these is a little less fantasy and a little more sci-fi, but I wanted to include it because it is pretty well known, and also I think it's really good, and I think that some of the sci-fi elements of it are more fantastical, and so I think that it is kind of both. So let's get that one out of the way first. So the first standalone fantasy that I really recommend is Piranese. This is by Susanna Clarke. This book is really interesting and weird. If you like weird fantasy and weird sci-fi, I think that you'll like this. So in this book we follow Piranese, and Piranese is kind of stuck in this house, and it's this giant house that's like ever expanding. It's like infinite. There's infinite numbers of rooms and stuff, and he's been stuck in this house for as long as he can remember, and he's like perfectly content with just exploring this house. And the weird thing about it is, so like the rooms are like, they continue to go on, but there's a tide. It's like a house that has an ocean in it. It's absolutely wild. And so there's a tide, and so he has to time his explorations by the tide. And so he's like perfectly content to do that. But there's another person in the house too that Piranese calls the other, and the other visits Piranese a couple of times a week. And you know, Piranese thinks that he's assisting this other person with research and stuff, and so that's all going fine and well. But then Piranese, in his exploration of the house, starts to discover that there was another person in the house at some point, and so that causes him to like try to unravel the mystery of where this other person came from. This book was nuts. Like, it was absolutely bonkers, and I remember reading it and thinking, wow, this is really weird. But this is like a book that, and I didn't think too much of it when I finished it, but this book has really stuck with me. Like the way that it's written, it's very like vivid. It created like a lot of vivid imagery like in my head, and it's one I just have not forgotten about, and I really think that it deserves all of the hype that it's gotten. So if that sounds intriguing to you, weird fantasy sci-fi, I really think this is a great book. And it's pretty short. I think it's only 200-ish pages. A standalone fantasy that I have talked at length about is Inkblood Sister Scribe by Emma Torz. I don't know if it's Emma Torres or Emma Torz. Not 100% sure there. But in this book, I think that this is probably an urban fantasy. This is set in our world, just there is magic. And so in this book, we follow two sisters, and they are estranged from each other. And the magic system, it involves books and writing books with blood. And so in this world, there are people who can see and sense the magic but can't write it. And there are people who can write the magic, but it doesn't affect them. So the two sisters are Joanna, who lives in Vermont, in rural Vermont, and she lives in a house by herself that was left to her by her father. And her sole purpose is to keep their collection of magical books safe and protected from, Joanna doesn't know what. She just knows that that was what, like, her father's dying wish was, that she keep the wards up around the house and protect the books. Her sister Esther is estranged from her, and we see Esther living on a base in Antarctica. And Esther, her father told her that every year on a certain date that she has to move. She has to leave where she is, leave everything behind, and move to a new location. Otherwise, her sister will be in danger. And so Joanna makes the mistake of deciding to stay somewhere longer than a year. She wants to stay in Antarctica because she has a girlfriend there, and that starts a chain of events that, you know, progresses throughout the book. I really enjoyed this. I really loved the relationship between the two estranged sisters and them coming back together. I thought this was really, really great. And if you're not sure about fantasy, like if you're wanting to dip your toe into the genre, I think that reading something like this where it's a little bit more lit fic than it is fantasy, I think that that's a good place to start. And I really thought that this book was great. Okay, so two more great standalone fantasies. These are by the same author, so I'm going to talk about them at the same time. Is A Master of Djinn and Ring Shout by Djeli Clarke. Ring Shout is a really short novella, and this one was really interesting. This one is, it's set in the South, and it is about a group of people who, sort of dystopian, and they're like hunting monsters that they're calling Ku Kluxes. Basically, it's where white supremacists are like actual literal monsters. Not that they are now, but like they're like nightmare monsters. And so it's this group of people and they're hunting these monsters. And this was really great. It's a very short read. Djeli Clarke has a very interesting writing style. I really enjoyed this a lot. And then A Master of Djinn is also really cool. It is very different. This is set in sort of a steampunk Egypt in early 1900s. This book follows Fatima, she's the youngest member of the Ministry of Alchemy. And Fatima is called to investigate the murder of a very prominent figure. And that is what sort of sets the, sets the events of this book in motion. These were both really great, completely different, really great standalone fantasies. Obviously, I couldn't talk about standalone fantasy without talking about Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This book is amazing. Like, it's so cute and sweet. It has a really cool magic system. It has a really cool premise. In this book, we follow Tress, and Tress has lived on an island her entire life. It's the only place that she's ever called home. And she finds herself in love with the governor's son. And the governor finds out about this, feels that Tress is of inferior birth, and sends his son away. And his son continues to write letters and stuff to Tress, but the letters stop one day and she decides she's going to go find him herself. And I just love this. Brandon Sanderson said that he wrote this for his wife, and I think that it is an incredibly cute and sweet love letter. It's funny, I was kicking my feet, I was giggling. The magic system, as I said, is cool. It's not a Brandon Sanderson book without a really cool magic system. So this is another great standalone fantasy, and if you're wanting to dip your toes into Brandon Sanderson's work, I think that this is a great place to start. If you're looking for a really great YA fantasy, I really encourage you to check out Margaret Rodgerson. I have read Sorcery of Thorns and An Enchantment of Ravens, and Sorcery of Thorns follows Elizabeth, and Elizabeth lives in a library. And in this library, there are magical books called grimoires, and the people who use them are called sorcerers. And at the very beginning of the book, there was an act of sabotage, and one of this library's most powerful grimoires gets set loose. And it's like the monster book from Harry Potter, the one that like gets under his bed and like chews, on stuff and like tries to attack him. That's what I imagine when she talks about these grimoires. But anyways, that's sort of like the beginning elements that set this book in motion. I really loved this. I thought the romance in this was really sweet. I loved the characters, and that's something that Margaret Rodgerson does really well. And Enchantment of Ravens is very similar. But in Enchantment of Ravens, well, I like the characters and stuff. The plot is not similar. And Enchantment of Ravens follows our main character, who is a painter, and she is one of the best painters in her, area. And a fae comes to her and wants a painting done, and she makes the mistake of painting a human emotion on his face and in his eyes, and that's like kind of a big no-no. And so the fae, he kind of takes her to show her off to all the other fae, like, look at what she can do. She can give us human emotions. And it's kind of like this cool thing, but then as things do with fae stories, it sort of goes downhill from there. I really enjoyed that one as well. And Margaret Rodgerson has also written a book called Vespertine. I have not read Vespertine yet, so I can't speak to that one, but A Sorcery of Thorns and An Enchantment of Ravens are both very good standalone fantasies. Winter's Orbit is very much a sci-fi, but I couldn't do a video about standalone books and not include this because it's one of my favorites. This is a gay space opera, and I there is pining. It's an arranged marriage. I absolutely adored this book. This book is so great. We follow, I don't know how to pronounce the characters' names. I read this and I didn't listen to it, so I have no idea how it's pronounced. Anyways, I'm gonna say Shannon. Shannon is our main character, and he is widowed. He was married to Prince Tam, who is a prominent figure. And when he's widowed, he gets remarried to Kim, who is to take Prince Tam's spot on like a council, you know, a governing body type situation. And Prince Tam died under suspicious circumstances, and so then these two try to figure out what happened to Prince Tam, and they also fall in love. So it becomes like arranged marriage, unlikely allies to lovers, and that's my favorite thing. I adore this book. The romance in this is, to me, perfect. There is so much tension between the characters. There is, you know, like, there's like the nervousness of being arranged marriage to another person. The one character is, you know, obviously upset that his husband has died, but his husband didn't treat him super great. So, whoopsie. And so he's nervous about being remarried. He's nervous about being, you know, the partner to a diplomat. And Kim is like, I'm doing this because it's what's required of me, and ends up falling in love. This was so wonderful. I adore Winter's Orbit. I have not read Ocean's Echo, which is the sequel to this, but it's set in the same world but different characters. I haven't read that one yet. I'm sure I'm gonna love it just as much. And I can't wait to see what else Everina Maxwell comes out with. And finally, the big one, Priory of the Orange Tree. I read Priory of the Orange Tree last year, and I really enjoyed it. What you should know about this book is, one, it's incredibly long, but two, it is multi-POV, and I think also multiple timelines sort of happening that all converge. I can't remember if I'm remembering that correctly. For some, I could see how this book would be incredibly confusing. The other complaints about this is that there's a lot of, like, not much happens up top. But for me, what I loved about that was the things that happened at the beginning of this, because they were very political. It was very politics, court scheming, and I really enjoyed that. There's also dragons in this, although technically I think they're like wyvern. I don't think they have, dragons have 4 legs, wyvern have back legs with wings, and then there's a couple other different classifications. So anyways, this is really great. I think that this deserves all of the hype that it gets. And what I really enjoyed about this was the multiple characters, like, kind of doing their own thing and then coming together for the end. But yeah, I really enjoyed this, and this has a prequel that has come out that's set in the distant future that you do not have to read in order to read this, and that one is A Day of Fallen Night, which I have not read yet, even though it was one of my most anticipated books of the year this year. But I still really enjoy Priory of the Orange Tree. So those were all of my most favorite standalone fantasy books. If you have any standalone fantasy or even standalone sci-fi, because, you know, let's be real, I couldn't help discussing Piranesi or Winter's Orbit. Be sure to put them in the comments, because I would love to have your recommendations for standalone fantasy books to read. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!